Good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome to the ITU Cork Breakfast Tech Talk on COVID-19, the race for a vaccine. Thanks for joining us. I know it's an early hour, so for those of you who got up purposely for this, thank you very much. This is the third and final in our series of the COVID-19 Tech Talks. My name is Gillian Bergen. I work at Dell Technologies, and on behalf of ITU Cork, it's my pleasure to welcome you all this morning to this information session. A few small updates before we get started. So this session is being recorded and we will make it available via social media in the coming days. We're going to keep the format nice and casual today, so our panelists will introduce themselves to you shortly. We're going to have no formal presentations with slides. So if, like a lot of people who've had your fill of video conferencing in the last few weeks, this is intended for you to be able to sit back, relax and enjoy the audio. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions later in the session, and we'll let you know when that is and how to use the Q&A functionality in Zoom. Okay, so there will also be a few polls popping up throughout the session. So Owen, if you can bring one up for us now, we'll show folks how that looks like and we'll answer our first one. So we do encourage you to have an opinion, and we will again publish these findings in an aggregate way on social media in the coming days. I think it was William Deming that said, you know, in God we trust and all others must bring data. So you are our data, and if you can provide that to us, ITU Cork will be able to publish into kind of a nice data visualization with some great kind of aggregate insights. So much appreciated, and thank you all for filling those out. Alrighty then. Okay, let's get started. We are here to talk all things vaccines. What are they? You know, are they our only defense against viruses? What might the COVID-19 one look like? And is technology going to be a game changer? And what will it take to distribute this vaccine to millions around the globe? I'd like to start by inviting all of our panel experts to tell us a little bit about themselves, what they do, and maybe what a typical work day looks like right now, and how that's changed since COVID-19. So we're going to give you 5 minutes each, and we'll go through them in sequence, and hopefully 5 to 7 minutes is reasonable for you to answer those questions. So maybe Dr. Olive Murphy, if we start with you, as a consultant microbiologist at the Bon Secure, you're very, very much at the front line. Can you talk us through what that looks like?
Okay, so I mean, life is very different to what we knew 12 weeks ago or 10 weeks ago. So we started, so my background is microbiology and infection control. So I suppose we really are on the front line. Now, many people look at me and say, well, you've been preparing for this for a long time. You must be delighted that this has happened. And obviously the answer to that is yes, we've anticipated that this was likely to happen. But no, we're actually obviously all struggling a little bit with how quickly this has taken over and how quickly this has spread, even though we did anticipate that that was a possibility, and that's why we've had all this preparedness. So how has our day changed? Well, fairly significantly. The workload in the hospital is totally different now. We're down to less than 50% capacity. All our routine work had to stop. And we've obviously had to relook at how we manage patients in terms of those with respiratory illness coming into the hospital. Testing has changed totally. So when this started, we didn't have an in-house test. We now have access to routine testing that will give us same-day results for our patients. So that's been a fairly fundamental change in the last 8 weeks. Things that would have previously taken us months, if not years, to negotiate changes within the hospital happen overnight. You know, if I suppose one of the big changes for me is if I say I need this, I get it immediately. I might have got it before, but it might have taken a little bit longer. So things are happening very quickly. And of course, you've got all the difficulty with the staff that are on the front line. It's really challenging for the staff. There's a lot of unknowns out there. We're not really able to answer some of the questions they may have, but they have to trust in us that we're going to keep them safe. So there's been an awful lot more of linking in with staff, reassuring them, retraining them, things that they already know, going back to the basics. So the amount of patient care that I'm delivering now compared to 8 weeks ago is a lot less. But it's allowed us to get ready for what's going to happen now over the coming year to 18 months, when we're going to be really continuing to work in a very different environment.
Super. Thanks, Olive. And we go next now to Professor Jim Imani. So you're Director of Pharmaceutical Biotechnology degree program at CIT and a Principal Investigator in BioExplore and Create. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and what your day looks like?
Sure. Thanks, Gillian, and thanks very much for the invite this morning. It's great to talk vaccines with lots of people this morning. So yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Biological Sciences in CIT. So the program I'm most heavily involved in is pharmaceutical biotechnology. So that's a program that's designed to teach students to understand more about how we make medicines, medicines for treating all types of different diseases, including infectious disease, from two perspectives really. One, how can we more effectively diagnose infectious disease and other types of human diseases? And secondly, how can we develop more effective therapies and interventions to treat those diseases? So we're very fortunate, I suppose, to be involved in a program that is really hitting those two criteria in the current climate that we're in, because the only thing that people are talking about in the last number of months is testing for coronavirus, and can we develop a therapy, can we develop a treatment? So it's great to be involved in a program that looks at those areas that are very, very topical at the minute. I'm also involved in a number of different research programs, mainly focused on infectious disease and public health. Predominantly, it's more bacterial infectious diseases is what I'm focused on. But I did my PhD on rotavirus, which is a virus. So I have some interest and some commonality with what's happening as well in the current situation. Life has changed very, very significantly. Obviously, I was fortunate enough to have the whole of the CIT campus as my playground for the last 15 years. But what you're looking at behind me is my current space, limited to an 8x10 room for doing my work, which is much less inviting or attractive. But everyone's in the same boat at the minute. So all the day-to-day lecturing activities and research activities have to take place from here. And we're very fortunate to have the technology to keep us in contact with our students and with our other staff members as well.
Super. Thanks, Jim. And indeed, yeah, we're all working from strange places and cupboards and ironing boards and everything at the moment. So it's a lot of agility, as they call it. Okay, I'm going to go next to Dr. Anne Moore, Senior Lecturer and Principal Investigator at UCC. So, and your group develops innovative vaccines and immunotherapies to address like unmet clinical needs. Can you help us understand what that means and what your day looks like right now?
Thanks, Gillian, and thanks for the invite to be here this morning. So I guess my background is vaccines, and how do vaccines work, and how do we make vaccines for infectious diseases that don't exist, or make better ones for ones that don't work as well as we want them to work. So similar to Olive, I've been kind of preparing for this eventuality for about 20 years. So I spent quite a bit of time in Oxford, who are the Jenner Institute in Oxford, where they are developing one of the vaccines that's currently in trial. And even back in the early 2000s, it was very much about, well, there is going to be a pandemic, what kind of vaccine should we develop? And there's a lot of, when you sit down and think about it, there are a lot of constraints and parameters that you want to meet to be able to make those vaccines. And I guess part of that is you have to understand, similar to Jim's work, the kind of pharmaceutics behind it, and how do you make the physical entity that's a vaccine. And then secondly, what actually happens when you put that into the body, and what is the immune response that you create. So by understanding one type of response, for some viruses you want an antibody response, and a lot of people have heard about antibodies in the last while. And then for other infectious diseases, you probably want more of the different arm of that part of the immune system called T cells. So understanding that, you can very much think about vaccine platforms then as to, do we want a T cell inducing vaccine, or do we want an antibody inducing vaccine, or do we want both? And then by developing vaccines for things like HIV or malaria, can you then use that platform and that knowledge to go into other diseases such as coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. So if you understand the immune system, then you can also think about developing immunotherapies as well for cancer and for other diseases as well. So there's a lot of crossover between making vaccines and really understanding what they're doing.
Brilliant, thanks Anna. We're going to talk some more later about not only the making of the vaccines but how they're administered. So we're going to move now to Aaron Rogan, news correspondent of the Sunday Business Post. And Aaron, I think this is our very first time having a news correspondent on the Tech Talk. So we're really excited to hear your unique perspective on this topic. Can you tell us how you're spending your days at the moment and what's the word on the street as you're hearing it?
I'm spending my days like a lot of people sat in front of the computer in the spare room, which is fine, but you lose a lot of the benefits, I'm sure as everyone does in business, of actually meeting people, running into people, bumping into people. It's obviously very useful for news reporting. Someone gives you a bit of a tip or something, just in day-to-day meetings as opposed to a scheduled phone call or Zoom or something like that. The word on the street at the moment is sort of, it's the same. We're hearing the same as you. It's coming thick and fast, the news, from a national and global perspective, and it's as much an idea, which I'm sure a lot of people are suffering with, trying to keep up and wondering what's actually important, what's going to be remembered tomorrow, because things happen so fast, because it's getting political now, it's getting geopolitical now, and it's sort of everyone keeps using the word unprecedented. You'll see it in nearly every newspaper front page, but it really is an unprecedented time. And between science, technology, politics, geopolitics, medicine, and then the human interest side of it as well, there's really never been more reporters really covering one story, probably outside of a war. So it's really every aspect of the newspaper, from your weather to your entertainment pages to the sport, is all absolutely consumed with this. So it's an interesting time to report on, but it's quite challenging as well.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, and I can definitely see that, like, you know, at the moment there is nothing else in the news bar this, but that is a reflection of just how much activity and news is going on around this. And as you said, reporting what's important and trying to, you know, navigate through that fog is hugely important. Okay, so on behalf of ITU Cork and our audience this morning, a sincere thank you to all our panellists for taking time out this morning. I know you're extremely busy, but sharing your expertise and advice with us, we are extremely grateful. So, okay, we're gonna crack in now and let's talk about some vaccines. So Jim, I'm gonna start with you if that's okay. Can you tell us what makes an effective vaccine? Like, are there criteria that must be met at an absolute minimum?
Sure. Making a vaccine is quite a complex process, which is why there's such a long timeline, and people are talking about, you know, maybe 12, 18 months before we can have an effective vaccine. That seems a very long time, but because of the complexity of making a vaccine, that's quite reasonable. You talk about criteria. The two most important criteria for any vaccine would be safety and efficacy, in that order. So a vaccine has to be safe. There's no point generating something that is very, very effective if it's not going to be safe to use, which again is why that timeline is so long. So it occurs in many different stages. The first step of any vaccine development program would be to have a basic understanding of the virus, so to know your enemy. And there are two ways of, I suppose, of doing that: knowing it structurally, but also knowing the inside, what makes it tick, the blueprint, the instructions that make the virus dangerous. And in record time, scientists had the genetic blueprint for this particular coronavirus strain very, very quickly. That allowed them to develop potential vaccine candidates, and I think there's well over 100 different research groups working on different vaccine candidates around the world. And many of them have gone into the next stage, which is preclinical testing. And even a few have graduated into the more elongated clinical trial stage, which is where these vaccine candidates are being tested in human populations. I'm sure Anne and some of the others will talk about them in a bit more detail, but in terms of stepwise process of generating a vaccine, that would be I suppose the longest and the most sensitive phase of developing any effective vaccine that is safe and efficacious. then of course it has to be approved. There has to be a regulatory approval occurring, and one of the biggest challenges, given the fact that this vaccine will have to be delivered to literally millions and billions of people, is production. To get the production level ramped up to a point where the vaccine can be safely distributed to all corners of the world, to safely immunize as many people as possible. And then for inoculation and compliance to occur. So for patients, and even from your poll there a while ago, there wasn't 100% compliance to people wanting to accept a vaccine, which is totally understandable, because there are issues and problems and controversies associated with vaccines as well. So we also need to try and iron that out and make doubly sure and triply sure that any vaccine that does make it to production and into global use is 100% safe. So because of the multiple stages, it is a very long and protracted process, but the two most important criteria are certainly to have a vaccine that is safe and a vaccine that is effective and generates long-lasting immunity.
Thanks, Jim. And Aaron, if I could bring you in there on a point that Jim mentioned, because I know you also wrote about it in a recent article. There are trials of over 100 possible vaccines going on right now, and this is a kind of a desperate search to find the one that works and that ticks the safety and efficacy boxes. From what you've researched, which ones look promising? How many are making it very far up that ladder in the 100?
Only a handful have made it to sort of preclinical trials so far. So there's basically over 100 candidates, we'd say, rather than 100 at any stage of further development. And we're seeing a lot of talk, and we've done it ourselves at the Business Post. We talk about this being a race, where people are, which gives the impression that some vaccines or researchers are ahead of others, and they are in terms of the trials, but as Jim said, it's safety and efficacy. You can't really race that, that's there or not. You either complete that race or don't. So it's more endurance and testing of these that comes into it. But in terms of those that have gone to the preclinical trials, and the ones that we've probably heard about in the news most would be the Jenner Institute in Oxford, which are working with a company called AstraZeneca to get to produce it if it does come. They've started the trials of humans 2 weeks ago. Then there are some of the US that have Pfizer. Moderna is one that's getting a lot of attention. They've got an RNA vaccine, and we've never had an RNA vaccine before, but it's quite an exciting development in the world of vaccines to use RNA. It's a model that has been around for about a decade or maybe a bit longer, that they can move at incredibly fast speeds, but only up until the clinical trials. There's no way of jumping that. So when we talk about a race or something being promising, we just don't know. We've plenty of times had vaccines developed and reached the last stage of trials, and the adverse reactions have been too severe, or for a small portion of the population. And obviously with the vaccine, you're looking at the entire or a significant portion of the population. If a small proportion of that population has a very severe adverse effect, it raises huge questions and concerns about the vaccine. We saw with swine flu, there's been some cases settled around it causing narcolepsy, the vaccine that was created for that, and there was sort of a feeling that that vaccine was rushed out because a lot of areas in the world were concerned about a second wave of the swine flu being quite severe. So there were plenty of interesting candidates. There are plenty of significant players in the pharmaceutical world. In fact, nearly all of the significant players in the pharmaceutical world are involved in this, either partnering with startups or small biotechs with interesting technology, or partnering directly with institutions such as Oxford. There's a huge amount of government money involved in this. There's international money from the World Health Organization and foundations like Bill Gates Foundation. So we've got everything in place for this. So it's, rather than saying any one candidate is promising, I think we should look at that all the efforts in the world should be promising, seen as promising, that the entire process that everyone's involved in is promising, and we are likely to see some promising candidates then towards the end of the year or early next year that we'll see ramp up production.
Fantastic, thanks, Aaron. And like as everyone has mentioned, vaccines are typically like a multi-year process. And you know, what makes us think we can get something effective in record time? You'll see maybe some of the people who are answering that earlier poll are thinking, you know, when something like this is rushed, then corners have to be cut. And what's getting cut in if anything, in this race for a vaccine for us to pick up this much needed time?
Well, I guess in the normal vaccine development process, you know, I mean, going back to any clinical vaccine development I've been involved in, it is very much about generating confidence around first of all, the preclinical, if you can show that it works in an animal model. Then, I mean, say in the Jenner in Oxford and other academic and small biotechs, it's about then raising the funding to do the phase 1 clinical trial. And it's about building the confidence that it is safe and it is, well, you can't look at efficacy, but you can look at the immune response that you induce. So normal clinical vaccine development projects, it's similar to a lot of other commercial projects. You're kind of convincing the director that it's worth investing more into the process. And that takes time, and nobody, you know, generally people don't invest until you have the results from the previous trial completed, and you can show that there is enough confidence, there's good safety signal, there's good immunogenicity signal. So that's usually why it ends up being so sequential, that you really have to finish off one before you move on to the next stage. So it is most generally a commercial decision to move ahead to the next phase, or to go back and repeat something, a different dose or a different schedule or something like that. So that's a really limiting factor. It's always been a limiting factor in every vaccine development project, is because the stages of vaccine development, I mean, it is very different to other medicinal products in the sense that a vaccine you're giving to healthy people, so the safety signal has to be much clearer even than for some drugs, not all drugs, but for some drugs. And secondly, when you go on to these challenge studies, these phase 2, phase 3 trials, where you want the efficacy, you want to see, does the vaccine protect from being infected? So you're almost looking for almost a negative signal. So to do that, you need thousands of people. So phase 2B trial, you're looking at maybe 5,000 individuals for your clinical trial, and phase 3 is hundreds of thousands of people. And if you're looking to see if it worked, you want to see that people don't get infected. So you have to see if that the people who got the placebo, the non-active vaccine, did get it. So again, that's a big issue in vaccine trials, and it's very different to drug trials where people are sick, you give them a drug, they're cured. With vaccines, you have to have enough disease around, unless you can challenge people in the lab with influenza virus or with the malaria parasite. And that's going to be a big issue for this vaccine development project by everyone. But usually the big issue with sequential or with vaccine development, and why it takes time, is because it's this sequential development, whereas now there's a huge amount of investment going into something will work, let's build the manufacturing facilities now, so that there's no time lost between getting results from the early clinical trials and moving on very quickly to the late clinical trials. And just
to reassure our listeners, is it safe to say that safety is never cut?
Safety is never cut, absolutely not.
It's things like office stuff and approvals and red tape, and they're the kind of things that
I mean, a classic example, I guess the closest example to a vaccine being developed in record time is the Ebola virus vaccine in West Africa. So I used to work on Ebola back in the late 90s, and a lot of people were interested in a vaccine at that stage, but there was no commercial interest, and there shouldn't have been. There was no need for it. But there were a few Ebola virus vaccines sitting in various labs and in a few companies around the world. And when there was a need for a vaccine, I mean, the Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa really paved the way for what we are doing now. And there was a lot of ethical discussions at that time. How do you do a clinical trial during, at that stage, an epidemic? And what are the moral and ethical correct things to do? If you have to show that your vaccine works and protects against disease. And to do that, you have to give some people a vaccine and other people a placebo, a different vaccine. how do you overcome that ethically with the sense that everybody's at risk of getting this disease? And with Ebola, there's a very high mortality rate. And a lot of those trials were done in triple quick time in West Africa, because that disease, as soon as they started vaccinating, and through good public health measures as well, the incidence of the disease came down. But it was like, you can do vaccine trials very quickly when you need to, when there is a public health emergency. And there's a lot of legislation and a lot of regulatory guidelines as well. And those regulatory guidelines have been there since the early 2000s, because everybody was preparing for a pandemic. So the regulators were preparing for it as well, but it was very much for everybody thought it was going to be influenza virus. So there's a lot of kind of, instead of cutting the red tape, it's here's different red tape when there's an emergency, and this is how we'll do it. Similar to what we see with the public health emergency legislation in the US.
And good to know that safety is never cut, so that's reassuring for a lot of listeners. Yeah. Olive, if I could move to you right now, I presume vaccine, like we're at this a long time, but I presume vaccine development has changed hugely over the last 10 years. And Aaron mentioned something called an RNA vaccine. Can you talk a little bit about how vaccine development has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on some of this already. So I suppose the globalization of information, the sharing of information, you know, genetics and how that has changed, our diagnostics generally. I mean, the world has really very much changed, and some of the problems that we've had have kind of pushed these changes further. So if you look back to the SARS epidemic back in the early 2000s, you know, that changed how we shared information. I think governments have changed in terms of how they actually approach and prepare for pandemics, although we've seen some modification of that prior to this pandemic, which is unfortunate, I think. But I think really it's the advances that we've had scientifically and in terms of globalization and the sharing of information that have been really important. Now, what we know with vaccine development, that safety has to be the priority, because people won't take the vaccine if they're not safe. And we've gone through all of that, and we've seen the impact of populations not accepting vaccines and the downstream effects of that. So at the, you know, where I see, you know, some of the change that happened with vaccines, really been trying to get improved uptake with vaccine as well. So it's not just the development and the safety, but then we have to roll out the vaccine programs, and how we've done that has changed a little bit again over the last 10 years. I think we've got better. For some vaccines, there's been low uptake. We've seen the effects of that. And again, it's about sharing information, monitoring what's going on, getting populations on board, and vaccinating the vulnerable groups as we go forward. But it's not easy to get people to necessarily always take up the vaccines that we're offering. You know, there's still lots of concerns amongst the public about vaccine safety. So it's very, very important, I think, that message is out there, that we don't roll out vaccines unless we're happy that they're safe, or as safe as they can be.
Indeed. And Jim, kind of building on the vaccine hesitancy and this idea of herd immunity, and Aaron actually had a great phrase in his report, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And, you know, we get a cohort who are happy to receive the vaccine, and then we have a cohort who don't believe in vaccines. They promote the body being able to support itself. And yet, you know, we rely on a big portion of the population to get vaccinated, and they protect, if you like, they protect the unvaccinated in so many ways. Do you think we're likely to see vaccine hesitancy and making it longer for us to get to this herd immunity?
I think it's likely, which is why the scientists and the regulators really have to do their jobs and make sure that everything is done to give absolute reassurance to the public that the vaccine, and probably vaccines, because there's likely to be more than one, are absolutely safe for use. You're right, this whole idea of herd immunity is a term that's kind of bandied about, and it's just another way, I suppose, really of ensuring that people have protection. There's two ways of getting protection against this virus. One is to be naturally exposed to it and to develop an immune response that protects the individual, and the other one, as we're talking about this morning, is to be vaccinated against it. So the combination of the two of those is what ultimately will provide protection for the majority of people in society. So I suppose what we're hoping for is that when a vaccine or a number of vaccine candidates eventually reach production and eventually reach society and can be administered in inoculations, that we will get as much compliance as possible. Herd immunity is something that will certainly help, and there's a little bit of that happening already, because obviously there is community transmission of this virus, but ultimately it's a vaccine, and possibly maybe some other therapies as well. There are other groups and other research and production facilities that are working on therapies that are not vaccine related but might offer other types of therapeutic approaches. So between a little bit of herd immunity, a lot of vaccination and a lot of compliance, and a lot of input from other research and development organizations looking at other types of antiviral therapies, I think we could be in a very more positive situation in 6 to 12 months.
Good to know that there's kind of a multi-pronged approach going on. Aaron, you know, in your article you also talked about technology being a game changer this time around. What have you seen in regards to technology out there that is making a huge difference to fighting this virus?
I was largely talking about the RNA messenger technology there, but just to pick up on some points there, I think when we talk about technology and vaccines, and this is an area I've been covering for 3 or 4 years, we should really, really concentrate on some of the misinformation on social media. That there's already a lot of anti-technology, anti-science, anti-vaccine groups out there. They've already affected the take-up of HPV and measles. Vaccines, and MMR, of course, is the classic example of Dr. Wakefield, former Dr. Wakefield, where he destroyed the take-up of a vaccine and created real panic about vaccines generally. We see these messages being pushed, you know, I'm in some sort of unsavory Facebook groups just to monitor for work in Ireland. We see these messages being pushed quite widely on social media, and they're not something that we pay a lot of attention to, because the arguments they're making aren't worth arguing with. But even if that is the case, we shouldn't take what they're saying lightly. We've seen 5G masts burned because of a conspiracy theory. I think this is going to be a real issue for this vaccine, particularly if it's an unsavory vaccine to take. Maybe it makes you feel quite unwell for a week or 2 weeks, and maybe that there's scientifically a reasonable level of adverse reaction, but there will be those news stories of if it does cause, just for example, based on the swine flu, if it does cause narcolepsy in a small number of people, and that's actually fine because we're inoculating nearly 7 billion people, those news articles will be out that this is a vaccine with dangers. These groups and these people and these politicians in many cases will seize on that to push their sort of anti-science, anti-vaccine agenda. And when we talk about technology around this, I think it's something that the social media companies in particular have done some work on. But you can still put into your Google search, you know, natural cancer cures, and you'll get links to things that look legitimate. Now, luckily, if you put in COVID-19 or coronavirus vaccines, you'll get a warning directing you to the World Health Organization and things like that. But it's really an area of concern. And then just sort of as a side note, another danger of technology on this, I just saw this morning that overnight the FBI in the US said that they believe China was trying to hack or interfere with their vaccine development. That's going to be an issue as well. If the whole world is working on this, this is the new arms race, this is the new space race. It's going to be seized on those aspects of the superpowers to get one ahead of each other. So there's going to have to the lines of collaboration that have been there, even between China and the United States, even though it doesn't look like they collaborate a lot, they have in this area since SARS. It's going to be a technological challenge to keep those lines of communication open, but also keeping them safe. And I think that's something we might see as the vaccines do get developed. We will see more about the technological side of that, of how this vaccine development is going to fit into our new internet age and face the challenges of that, because there are real concerns.
Thanks, Aaron. And I guess the big message for everyone there is, you know, don't get your data from Facebook and social media, use reputable sources and you know, triangulate multiple sources against each other to see what is actually, you know, factually correct and just noise. And is it possible to say at this stage whether the vaccine is likely to be like a single dose or a multiple dose, and could it provide lifelong cover or something that needs a booster in years to come, or is it too early to speculate?
I guess it kind of comes back to this idea of being slightly conservative. You want to make sure that everybody will be covered. So ultimately, a single shot vaccine would be perfect. But if you were somebody sitting in the regulator's office in Dublin or in wherever they are now, Rotterdam, you know, some people, we're humans, everybody's a little bit different, and a single shot may not protect everybody, may not be enough for everybody to be protected. So from a kind of conservative estimate, people usually kind of will start with at least 2 vaccines to administer to people. And hope that will protect. I mean, it might start off as even 3 vaccines. Now, a vast proportion, if the vaccine is any good, which it should be, 1 shot will protect a lot of people. So you will get some immunity even from 1 shot. But really, when you give 1 shot, it's into people. If you haven't been exposed to the virus before, you have no immunity, which really is just a memory response. You've no memory, you've never seen it before. And your body needs to be educated against that particular, against coronavirus. So you then, to kind of reinforce that lesson, you'll give a second shot. And really it is about being conservative. It's making sure that everybody has immunity. But again, a single shot, like you really want your first vaccine, because some people, as we've talked about already, with vaccine hesitancy and low vaccine uptake, some people just don't come back for their second shot. So you do want to give yourself the best possibility of immunizing and protecting as many people as possible. But I can't see a regulator signing off on a single shot vaccine.
Interesting. And I'm going to go to Olive next, but in the meantime, I'm going to encourage folks to please submit your questions now for our panelists through the Q&A functionality there at the bottom of your screen. If your question is directed to a particular member of the panel, you might put that name in there. Otherwise, we'll throw it open to the panel to whoever wants to take it. Olive, I'm going to go a little controversial. Sorry if we're hitting you with the controversial question, but what's not helpful right now? So, you know, and it's been touched on, we're seeing countries withdrawing funding from the World Health Organization. We're seeing trust breaking down between certain relationships. Is now the right time to pick those fights, be they legitimate or not? Should they wait until we come out the other side of this and have those conversations then to be more, you know, productive, for want of a better word?
Yeah. Obviously now isn't the right time, I think, to be picking those types of fights. I mean, I think we'll all look back and learn lessons. We always do. So that's good. I mean, as we've already alluded to, we've known this is coming. I mean, you know, there was always going to be a pandemic. It was just a matter of when and which virus. We probably thought it was more likely to be an influenza type virus, but I suppose in the early 2000s. So lots of governments have actually been preparing, but then a number have taken a back step in terms of preparedness. And of course, it's hard to spend money preparing for something that hasn't actually happened. We have the same dilemma with infection control in hospitals. You know, you're asking people to spend money to prevent something. So you're asking people to spend money on something that's not necessarily going to happen right now. And it's a really difficult thing. But I think that's one lesson that we learned, that when you stand down your preparedness committees, like some of the major countries did in the run up to this, then you're going to be slow off the mark to get going. Now, having said that, I mean, things have moved incredibly quickly. So I think other governments have, but you know, sort of being like overcritical and undermining some of the work that's going on. You know, everyone obviously has the right to have an opinion, but leadership, I think we are seeing a little bit, and I'm sure history will support this. You know, leadership is really important at this stage when we're in such difficult times, that, you know, if you've got good, strong leaders, and sometimes you end up just having to take the chance and you make a decision about what's most important at that point in time. So not the time to be picking those battles, I don't think.
Yeah. Be they legitimate or otherwise. So I'm going to call out some questions now from our audience, and jump in, anyone on the panel, jump in if you'd like to take the particular question. So there's one around, normally there's big concentration at times like this around the typical annual flu. And those, people will be concentrating on that vaccine. Are we taking our eye off the annual flu now, in favor of all efforts and all concentration being on COVID-19?
Yeah, as far as I know, and I haven't looked at this, it is a good question. Normal vaccine production is continuing for all licensed vaccines, and out of any of those, we definitely need a flu vaccine before the next flu season, or else it's a respiratory pathogen as well. We don't want to be clogging up our hospitals again and keeping all of us very busy. So the for COVID vaccine, there's a lot of work going into developing new manufacturing facilities and building those specifically to produce them by the billion. Flu vaccines in particular are made by most of them are made by very different technology compared to what would be used for a COVID vaccine. So it's unlikely, at least for flu anyway, and for other vaccines as well, where we don't know what to bulk manufacture at the moment. So the manufacturing facilities will, I presume, continue for what they're intended for at the moment. I mean, maybe Jim has some insight into that as well.
No, I was just going to add to it, and really, I agree 100%. We need to be ultimately cautious about all types of infectious diseases. And as Aaron was saying earlier, the whole world is talking about COVID-19, but the other types of infectious diseases haven't gone away either. If you look at even something like sepsis, there are more deaths now worldwide from sepsis than there are from cancer. So we are unfortunately under attack from all sides, and even though coronavirus is the only thing that people can talk about currently, there are lots of other potential pathogens out there that we need to take a look at, and maybe that should inform how we improve our practices going forward as a society, not just preventing COVID and making sure that we put a stop to this as soon as possible, but also looking at the bigger impact of how we're going to deal with the potential threat of other infectious diseases, some of which will be trivial and some of which will be quite substantial.
Perfect, thank you. And Olive, there's a question in for you from Colin. It seems to make sense that the frontline workers and maybe those with underlying conditions should be the first to get the vaccine and get the first generation of the vaccine. Do you think a lot of your colleagues will be first in the row for the vaccine when it's available?
Difficult, actually. I mean, when we look at influenza uptake, we have to work very hard to get healthcare workers to take up influenza vaccine on an annual basis. Now the uptake rates have been improving. It's a lot of work. If you look at the various occupational health departments and our Department of Infection Control, we have to spend a lot of time persuading healthcare staff to take up the vaccine. I think it's all going to depend on the safety profile of this vaccine. Now, obviously, there's a lot of concern amongst the healthcare frontline staff in terms of this disease. And I would hope that once we have a safe vaccine, the uptake will be. But I don't think we should underestimate how challenging it is to persuade people to take up vaccines. There's a lot of work needs to go into doing that, including those on the front line, where you'd expect, personally, I would expect people to take this vaccine when offered, assuming that it's got a good safety profile, but that doesn't always translate based on our previous experience.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I think, sharing of information and being transparent with everyone, including the general public, I think will go a long way into driving those uptake numbers. We have a question in there from Denise as well. There's a lot of press regarding the using of a drug combination approach for the treatment of COVID-19 that reduces the length of time a patient takes to recover in mild to moderate cases. Are we using that approach in Ireland? So drug combination approach?
No, I mean, so there's the National Committee have produced guidelines which have been really very helpful. So for patients with mild disease, it's supportive care. For the more severe illness, what we're trying to do, and this is, you know, again, the Infectious Disease Society of America have supported this as well, is we're trying to use a registry basis for monitoring the treatments. So really, I think most drugs that we are using should really be part of clinical trials. We really don't know enough about how we should be treating this, and we need to be really cautious about doing that. So I think that's the route that the national group have taken. So they have made recommendations, but a lot of this will be run through registries where we'll be monitoring impact and trying to have a look at outcome. And of course, we get better data that way that we can then share and at least look at the outcome data. It's really important that we do it that way, I think.
Perfect, thank you. And John, thank you for your question. I'm going to direct it to Aaron first, and then maybe if any of the others want to jump in. And it is literally, where have we moved to now? It's just jumped off my screen. Is the virus likely to be around forever, or likely to turn into one that, you know, gets wiped out completely out of existence, almost like TB or polio did? They kind of came off the charts once there was an effective vaccine. What are you hearing out there in regard to that kind of scenario?
Well, the World Health Organization said yesterday that we should be preparing for this coronavirus to be around forever, and that's certainly the most cautious place as we are. Even if, you know, the Rna, the reproduction rate, even if we beat this back before a vaccine so that it's burning itself out, there will still be pockets of places with outbreaks, and then maybe we get an effective vaccine that does eradicate it. But those ifs are absolutely enormous, because, as we were talking about earlier, you need to administer the vaccine to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people just to prove its efficacy and safety. So we need to have the virus around for that. We're not going to become part of a 7 billion person experiment waiting for that. Economies will need to reopen, and there'll need to be other efforts and antivirals and things like that before we get to that stage. So I think we should be preparing, certainly, is the guidance for this to be around for, if not forever, for a long time, and for versions of it to come back. And we should, you know, we're speaking to 3 other people whose jobs are to prepare for these things. So hopefully this sparks a wave of preparedness, which is not something we've seen in the last while. I suppose we've probably lived in quite privileged times over the last few decades where we haven't had global viruses or world wars to sort of remind us of how fragile our existence is. And as we become more global, it becomes sort of more fragile, because these things can spread quite quickly, and the things we're used to can be destroyed quite quickly. So certainly we should be preparing for this to be around for a long time.
And Aaron, that or not reference that you mentioned, that's the virus's ability. So if someone gets it, how many people they're likely to infect? Is that? Okay.
Yes, that's the reproduction rate, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Donna's question next. So he thanks the panelists for your time. He's enjoying the discussion. What's your opinion on recent reports indicating that children do not significantly contribute to the COVID-19 spread, and how convincing is the reported data? Would like to take that one. It's a bit of a moving target, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're infectious, they're not, they're vectors. Oh, hang on, they're not.
I think all of his best place.
Well, we know, yeah, I mean, we know, look, they have got a little bit of a bad rap, I must say, for children, but we know children are good at spreading viruses, generally. I mean, all of us that have had small children, you know, can remember the early days when we sort of cycled through somewhere between 10 and 12 upper respiratory viral infections a year. I suppose what we don't really know, so children we know don't seem to get severe disease, so they seem to get a mild illness, although there are reports now of an inflammatory condition possibly linked to COVID. So there's an awful lot that we don't really know about this disease yet. So that those reports coming out of the States and England, and lots of very sick children with associated mortality. So I suppose we don't know for definite that children will always remain well, but we know that they don't get very severe illness. I think it is likely that they spread. I don't really like the term super spreaders. I think it's unfair to children. But, you know, if you put a lot of people into close environments, and kids spread things back and forth all the time, then it's very likely that they're going to spread this virus as well. I can't see why children are going to be any different to adults. So I think once you congregate any group in a small confined space, then this virus looks like it's very successful at transmitting. But I suppose the argument about children is whether we should open up schools and how we're going to manage that. So I don't think we should be blaming children for being super spreaders, if that's a term. Like I said, I don't really like it. I don't know whether Anne agrees with that.
They might be an important way for us to get to herd immunity quickly.
Yeah.
And actually, there's another question for you there from Jerry, and it kind of touches on what was just mentioned as well. So, you know, we're reading a lot about we're starting to see now a lot about the other impacts that COVID-19 is having on the liver, on the heart, on kidneys, on parts of the body. At the beginning, we really didn't think it had any impact on. This question is specifically on blood clots. So we're hearing it does call like congealing of the blood and that kind of thing. Is that becoming a big issue for patients, and is it large scale, and do we know why it's happening?
Yeah, I've seen some reports, and I haven't really delved into it, so I'm probably not the person to comment on this. Is probably back to Olive as well. I mean, they are finding microclots and things like that. So Olive, it's
So again, I mean, it's a really interesting disease because we haven't seen anything like this before. So 85% of us seem to have a mild, maybe, you know, not so mild for other people. We don't really get sick, but then you get this second phase somewhere around day 10, and these patients come in and they're very unwell. And what we're seeing now from, unfortunately, looking at some of the postmortems on some of these patients that don't survive, is that a lot of them have small clots, and there seems to be a definite problem with clotting in these patients. And in fact, some centres now are using anticoagulant therapy as one of the mainstays. So if you look at some of the data coming out of Italy, they've seen quite a significant benefit to anticoagulating patients using some of the newer anticoagulants. So we're learning an awful lot about the pathogenesis that we didn't really understand before, and that we haven't really seen with some of the other viruses to this level. So yeah, no, it is definitely, and may give therapeutic options, like I say, that so you can have a patient, they don't present like the normal flu cases, even the cases that we've had here. You know, they come in, they don't look very unwell, and yet they're desaturating. I mean, there's reports of patients where their oxygen levels are really almost incompatible with them being alive, and yet they're sitting up in the bed talking, which is something that we don't normally see. So how the disease is affecting the lung and what exactly is happening at a tissue level is really still being investigated. But clotting does seem to be an important part of it.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Jim, I'm going to give you the question from Seamus, and feel free to kick it on if you think somebody else is best placed to answer it. Does the body build up natural immunity if infected by the virus, and therefore you're less likely or unlikely to get reinfected? That's kind of moving in the news as well too. 1 minute, you know, it's yes, you build up immunity. Okay, it might only last 2 or 3 years, but can we say with any certainty now that you do build up some immunity if you've had it?
It's a very good question, and it's probably best directed to an immunologist. But my basic understanding of it would be if you're exposed to any virus, of course your body's natural defense mechanism would be to develop a protective response, which would mean that if you are re-exposed to that virus, there's a very high likelihood that either you won't develop symptoms or the symptoms will be less severe. In the case of coronavirus, we're still in the very, very early stages, so it's very hard to have hard data, because you're looking at 12 weeks of dealing with this virus globally. It's not enough time for us to be absolutely sure or definitive that either we can be reinfected or that the symptoms that we develop the second time around are going to be any less severe. But if it's similar to other viruses, there's a very high likelihood that either we don't get reinfected or that the symptoms are much less severe.
Yeah, I guess to add to that, I mean, what we see with other respiratory pathogens such as RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, is that you can have antibodies, but they're kind of almost diverted to looking at something different, and they won't protect you against reinfection. And what we know from this current coronavirus is that, and studies have come out for severely infected patients, and they do have high levels of antibody, of IgG. What we don't know, and from coronavirus studies for a different coronavirus that were done in the 1990s, those IgG levels can stay quite high. But again, if you come back and deliberately infect those people with that particular coronavirus back in the 1990s, they will become infected again. So this comes back to the idea that it really is about having antibodies that are neutralizing, that are actually the most effective at preventing the virus from infecting the body. What we don't know at the moment is if somebody, a lot of people who seem to be kind of transiently infected or have a low level of infection may not present, and they might have an antibody response, how long that lasts for. So it's kind of a classic pharmacology of a dose response. If you get a low dose of virus, you might induce a little bit of an antibody response, but it may not be durable. So you might have a little peak and then it goes away again. So this is a big worry that people will get reinfected. So you may have an antibody, you may be infected, you may induce a very short-term antibody response, but then you're back to being being susceptible again. This is why with a vaccine, you are going to avoid all of that. You're going to induce a strong antibody response that has memory and is durable. So you are protected for at least a number of years, and hopefully with a 2-shot vaccine or something like that, that you will be protected for a long, long time.
Very good case then for getting the vaccine when it comes out, so that it generates, as you said, the right antibody response, which is very interesting. We throw a little controversial question in there now for whoever wants to take it. Given the fact that we're most likely to not have a vaccine by this coming winter, is there an argument to use the summer months to actually increase herd immunity? And by that we mean, allow the virus to spread a little bit over the summer in a kind of a controlled fashion, so that we go into the winter with some level of herd immunity. Who'd like to take that one?
I guess it comes back to the point of well, with herd immunity, you need a lot of people to be protected, and it to some extent it depends on the infection, and maybe Olive can speak to that in a second, before you are protecting the most vulnerable in society. But again, with coronaviruses and with some other respiratory pathogens, it comes to this: you have a little transient amount of antibody, and then it tapers away. So trying to generate, it's not influenza, it's not other diseases. It's more like kind of a common cold, if you think of it that way. You're susceptible to reinfection very quickly. So we don't have herd immunity to a common cold, so we're unlikely to have it again. Unlikely, I don't know, but less likely to have it against this coronavirus, because from the data that's coming out, if you're severely infected, I would hazard a guess that you would be protected for a long time because you have such high antibody levels. But for, I think, the vast majority of us who aren't ending up in ICU, we might get a little bit of antibody, a little bit of it, part of that will be neutralizing, as in it'll protect against infection, but the rest won't. So we are prone to being infected again. So herd immunity, I think, is going to be very, very difficult to achieve, if at all possible. Yeah. Got
it. And we're coming up on time, and I know we have a good few questions still unanswered because there's a huge interest in this whole subject. But I'm going to wrap up quickly by going to our quickfire questions. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists for like a an 8-second answer on, if you had a magic wand right now and you could fix one thing overnight that would help us get to where we need to be in regard to a vaccine, what would that be? Jim, we'll go to you first.
Oh, 8 seconds. To have the fastest possible clinical trials ever and to determine safety and efficacy overnight. That's impossible, but if you had a magic wand, that's what you'd want, is a vaccine tomorrow based on successful safety and efficacy. Yeah.
Got it. Aaron, your overnight fix?
Well, yeah, I would take Jim's as well. I'd have it tomorrow, but if we can't have Jim's, I'll have it the day after. I think one thing is that a magic wand, I'd like this to be distributed not based on wealth. So there's a big concern at the moment that if American researchers get the vaccine, or American and German researchers get the vaccine developed, that they get it first. That may not be the best way to administrate it. So I'd like that maybe the World Health Organization. That's not the most popular organization at the moment, but that people could take a step back and go, who really and truly needs this vaccine? Who's got the least ICU capacity? Things like that, that we consider that when we're distributing the vaccine.
Great point. So not just who can buy it first, but who needs it most. Olive, your overnight wand fix?
Well, obviously the same answer is really a vaccine, and that it's, you know, that it is given to the most vulnerable first, so that they can be protected. I mean, this is all about trying to keep the vulnerable groups out of our intensive care units, really. You know, so we know that 85% of us will actually have a mild disease. So really, we need to be looking at targeting the most vulnerable group once we do get this vaccine, I think, and as opposed, you know, and then obviously getting the economy back. But the majority of us will have a mild illness with this. But we need to be protecting the vulnerable.
The vulnerable groups. Perfect. And Anne, over to you for the magic wand fix.
The magic wand would be to invest more funding into research so that we can make a stable vaccine that can be distributed. So you take the technical aspect out of distributing the vaccine widely, and then obviously investing in organisations like Gavi as well to make sure that it is equitably distributed. But really, you know, in Ireland, we definitely need more funding into research so that there are people trained as well to go and work in vaccine production facilities, and we need to do that.
Perfect. And something tells me UCC and CIT and some of the others are going to see uptake numbers for education and degree programs in all of this area a lot over the next couple of years, which is good news.
I think so, yeah.
So if you can kind of socially space them all 2 meters apart, that'll be wonderful. But enormous thanks to our panel. So Dr. Olive Murphy from the Bon Secours, Professor Jim Murphy from CIT, Dr. Anne Moore from UCC, and news correspondent Aaron Rogan. Huge thank you. We hear a lot lately, you know, that not all heroes wear capes, and today those heroes, they're wearing medical scrubs, they're using microscopes, they're creating leading edge knowledge and insights, they're giving the public a voice, and they're defending the truth. So a huge thank you for you joining us this morning on this panel, and you're selfless in this pursuit of a post COVID-19 world. So you are all our heroes. So thank you so much. Special thank you also to the ITU Cork project team, so Owen Imani, Jerry Murphy, James Sillington, and Vivian O'Mani. Huge thank you there. That's it from us. I guess as the world holds its breath now for an effective vaccine in the hope of returning to life as we know it, the big message is be well, stay safe, and thanks for tuning in. Have a good morning.